Chapter 16 of the Peterkin Papers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Anderson in Spokane, Washington. The Peterkin Papers by Lucretia P. Hale. Chapter 16. The Peterkins are obliged to move. Agamemnon had long felt it an impropriety to live in a house that was called a semi-detached house when there was no other semi to it. It had always remained wholly detached, as the owner had never built the other half. Mrs. Peterkin felt this was not a sufficient reason for undertaking the terrible process of a move to another house when they were fully satisfied with the one they were in. But a more powerful reason forced them to go. The track of a new railroad had to be carried directly through the place, and a station was to be built on that very spot. Mrs. Peterkin so much dreaded moving that she questioned whether they could not continue to live in the upper part of the house and give up the lower part to the station. They could then dine at the restaurant, and it would be very convenient about traveling, as there would be no danger of missing the train, if one were sure of the direction. But when the track was actually laid by the side of the house, and the steam engine of the construction train puffed and screamed under the dining-room windows, the engineer calmly looked in to see what the family had for dinner. She felt indeed that they must move. But where should they go? It was difficult to find a house that satisfied the whole family. One was too far off and looked into a tan pit. Another was too much in the middle of town, next door to a machine shop. Elizabeth Eliza wanted a porch covered with vines that should face the sunset, while Mr. Peterkin thought it would not be convenient to sit there looking towards the west in the late afternoon, which was his only leisure time, for the sun would shine in his face. The little boys wanted a house with a great many doors, so that they could go in and out often. But Mr. Peterkin did not like so much slamming, and felt there was more danger of burglars with so many doors. Agamemnon wanted an observatory, and Solomon John a shed for a workshop. If he could have carpenter's tools and a workbench, he could build an observatory if it were wanted. But it was necessary to decide upon something, for they must leave their house directly. So they were obliged to take Mr. Finch's at the Corners. It satisfied none of the family. The porch was a piazza and was opposite a barn. There were 3 other doors, too many to please Mr. Peterkin and not enough for the little boys. There was no observatory, and nothing to observe if there were one, as the house was too low and some high trees shut out any view. Elizabeth Eliza had hoped for a view, but Mr. Peterkin consoled her by deciding it was more healthy to have to walk for a view, and Mrs. Peterkin agreed that they might get tired of the same every day. And everybody was glad a selection was made, and the little boys carried their india-rubber boots the very first afternoon. Elizabeth Eliza wanted to have some system in the moving, and spent the evening in drawing up a plan. It would be easy to arrange everything beforehand, so that there should not be the confusion that her mother dreaded, and the discomfort they had in their last move. Mrs. Peterkin shook her head. She did not think it possible to move with any comfort. Agamemnon said a great deal could be done with a list and a program. Elizabeth Eliza declared if all were well arranged, a program would make it perfectly easy. They were to have new parlor carpets, which could be put down in the new house the first thing. Then the parlor furniture could be moved in, and there would be 2 comfortable rooms in which Mr. and Mrs. Peterkin could sit while the rest of the move went on. Then the old parlor carpets could be taken up for the new dining room and the downstairs bedroom, and the family could meanwhile dine at the old house. Mr. Peterkin did not object to this, though the distance was considerable, as he felt exercise would be good for them all. Elizabeth Eliza's program then arranged that the dining-room furniture should be moved the third day, by which time one of the old parlor carpets would be down in the new dining-room, and they could still sleep in the old house. Thus there would always be a quiet, comfortable place in one house or the other. Each night when Mr. Peterkin came home, he would find some place for quiet thought and rest, and each day there should be moved only the furniture needed for a certain room. Great confusion would be avoided and nothing misplaced. Elizabeth Eliza wrote these last words at the head of her program: "Misplace nothing." And Agamemnon made a copy of the program for each member of the family. The first thing to be done was to buy the parlor carpets. Elizabeth Eliza had already looked at some in Boston, and the next morning she went by an early train with her father, Agamemnon, and Solomon John to decide upon them. They got home about 11 o'clock, and when they reached the house were dismayed to find 2 furniture wagons in front of the gate already partly filled. Mrs. Peterkin was walking in and out of the open door, a large book in one hand and a duster in the other, and she came to meet them in an agony of anxiety. What should they do? The furniture carts had appeared soon after the rest had left for Boston, and the men had insisted upon beginning to move the things. In vain she had shown Elizabeth Eliza's program. In vain had she insisted they must take only the parlor furniture. They had declared they must put the heavy pieces in the bottom of the cart and the lighter furniture on top. So she had seen them go into every room in the house and select one piece of furniture after another, without even looking at Elizabeth Eliza's program. She doubted if they could have read it if they had looked at it. Mr. Peterkin had ordered the carters to come, but he had no idea they would come so early, and supposed it would take them a long time to fill the carts. But they had taken the dining-room sideboard first. A heavy piece of furniture and all its contents were now on the dining-room tables. Then, indeed, they selected the parlor bookcase, but had set every book on the floor. The men had told Mrs. Peterkin they would put the books in the bottom of the cart, very much in the order they were taken from the shelves. But by this time Mrs. Peterkin was considering the carters as natural enemies, and dared not trust them. Besides, the books ought all to be dusted. So she was now holding one of the volumes of Agamemnon's encyclopedia with difficulty in one hand, while she was dusting it with the other. Elizabeth Eliza was in dismay. At this moment 4 men were bringing down a large chest of drawers from her father's room, and they called to her to stand out of the way. The parlors were a scene of confusion. In dusting the books, Mrs. Peterkin neglected to restore them to the careful rows in which they were left by the men, and they lay in hopeless masses in different parts of the room. Elizabeth Eliza sunk in despair upon the end of a sofa. "It would have been better to buy the red and blue carpet," said Solomon John. "Is not the carpet bought?" exclaimed Mrs. Peterkin. And then they were obliged to confess that they had been unable to decide upon one, and had come back to consult Mrs. Peterkin. "What shall we do?" asked Mrs. Peterkin. Elizabeth Eliza rose from the sofa and went to the door, saying, "I shall be back in a moment." Agamemnon slowly passed round the room, collecting the scattered volumes of his encyclopedia. Mr. Peterkin offered a helping hand to a man lifting a wardrobe. Elizabeth Eliza soon returned. "I did not like to go and ask her, but I felt that I must in such an emergency. I explained to her the whole matter, and she thinks we should take the carpet at McKillen's." McKillen's was a store in the village, and the carpet was the only one all the family had liked without any doubt, but they had supposed they might prefer one from Boston. The moment was a critical one. Solomon John was sent directly to McKillen's to order the carpet to be put down that very day. But where should they dine? Where should they have their supper? And where was Mr. Peterkin's quiet hour? Elizabeth Eliza was frantic. The dining-room floor and table were covered with things. It was decided that Mr. and Mrs. Peterkin should dine at the Bromwicks, who had been most neighborly in their offers, and the rest should get something to eat at the baker's. Agamemnon and Elizabeth Eliza hastened away to be ready to receive the carts at the other house and direct the furniture as they could. After all, there was something exhilarating in this opening of the new house, and in deciding where things should go. Gaily Elizabeth Eliza stepped down the front garden of the new home and across the piazza and to the door, but it was locked, and she had no keys. "Agamemnon, did you bring the keys?" she exclaimed. No, he had not seen them since the morning, when, yes, the little boys were allowed to go to the house for their india-rubber boots, as there was a threatening of rain. Perhaps they had left some door unfastened. Perhaps they had put the keys under the doormat. No, each door, each window was solidly closed, and there was no mat. "I shall have to go to the school to see if they took the keys with them," said Agamemnon, "or else go home to see if they left them there." The school was in a different direction from the house, and far at the other end of the town, for Mr. Peterkin had not yet changed the boys' school, as he proposed to do after their move. "That will be the only way," said Elizabeth Eliza, for it had been arranged that the little boys should take their lunch to school and not come home at noon. She sat down on the steps to wait, but only for a moment, for the cart soon appeared turning the corner. What should be done with the furniture? Of course the carters must wait for the keys, as she should need them to set the furniture up in the right places. But they could not stop for this. They put it down upon the piazza, on the steps, in the garden, and Elizabeth Eliza saw how incongruous it was. There was something from every room in the house, even the large family chest, which had proved too heavy for them to travel with, had come down from the attic and stood against the front door. And Solomon John appeared with the carpet woman and a boy with a wheelbarrow bringing the new carpet, and all stood and waited. Some opposite neighbors appeared to offer advice and look on, and Elizabeth Eliza groaned inwardly that only the shabbiest of their furniture appeared to be standing full in view. It seemed ages before Agamemnon returned, and no wonder, for he had been to the house, then to the school, then back to the house, for one of the little boys had left the keys at home in the pocket of his clothes. Meanwhile the carpet woman had waited, and the boy with the wheelbarrow had waited, and when they got in they found the parlor must be swept and cleaned. So the carpet woman went off in dudgeon, for she was sure there would not be enough time to do anything. And one of the carts came again, and in their hurry the men set the furniture down anywhere. Elizabeth Eliza was hoping to make a little place in the dining room where they might have their supper and go home to sleep. But she looked out, and there were the carters bringing the bedsteads and proceeding to carry them upstairs. In despair, Elizabeth Eliza went back to the old house. If she had been there, she might have prevented this. She found Mrs. Peterkin in an agony about the entry oilcloth. It had been made in the house, and how could it be taken out of the house? Agamemnon made measurements. It certainly could not go out of the front door. He suggested it might be left till the house was pulled down, when it could easily be moved out of one side. But Elizabeth Eliza reminded him that the whole house was to be moved without being taken apart. Perhaps it could be cut in strips narrow enough to go out. One of the men loading the remaining cart disposed of the question by coming in and rolling up the oilcloth and carrying it on top of his wagon. Elizabeth Eliza felt she must hurry back to the new house. But what should they do? No beds here, no carpets there. The dining room, table, and sideboard were at the other house, the plates and forks and spoons here. In vain she looked at her program. It was all reversed. Everything was misplaced. Mr. Peterkin would suppose they were to eat here and sleep here, and what had become of the little boys? Meanwhile, the man with the first cart had returned. They fell to packing the dining-room china. They were up in the attic, they were down in the cellar. Even one suggested to take the tacks out of the parlor carpets, as they should want to take them next. Mrs. Peterkin sunk upon a kitchen chair. "Oh, I wish we had decided to stay and be moved in the house," she exclaimed. Solomon John urged his mother to go to the new house, for Mr. Peterkin would be there for his quiet hour. And when the Carters at last appeared, carrying the parlor carpets on their shoulders, she sighed and said, "There is nothing left," and meekly consented to be led away. They reached the new house to find Mr. Peterkin sitting calmly in a rocking chair in the piazza, watching the oxen coming into the opposite barn. He was waiting for the keys, which Solomon John had taken back with him. The little boys were in a horse-chestnut tree at the side of the house. Agamemnon opened the door. The passages were crowded with furniture. The floors were strewn with books. The bureau was upstairs that was to stand in a lower bedroom. There was not a place to lay a table. There was nothing to lay upon it, for the knives and plates and spoons had not come. And although the tables were there, they were covered with chairs and boxes. At this moment came a covered basket from the lady from Philadelphia. It contained a choice supper, and forks and spoons, and at the same moment appeared a pot of hot tea from an opposite neighbor. They placed all this on the back of a bookcase lying upset, and sat around it. Solomon John came rushing in from the gate. "The last load is coming. We are all moved," he exclaimed, and the little boys joined in a chorus. "We are moved! We are moved!" Mrs. Peterkin looked sadly round. The kitchen utensils were lying in the parlor lounge, and an old family gun on Elizabeth Eliza's hat box. The parlor clock stood on a barrel. Some coal scuttles had been placed on the parlor table. A bust of Washington stood in the doorway, and the looking-glasses leaned against the pillars of the piazza. But they were moved. Mrs. Peterkin felt, indeed, that they were very much moved. End of chapter 16.